Welcome back to our adventure through the book of Exodus. Mark Twain said that a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is still putting on its boots. And boy, isn't this the truth? What we're going to see today is in the book of Exodus some precepts about law and justice and mercy as we continue to see these covenant law and display, which becomes sort of a case law for the elders and for Moses to use in dealing with the tribe of Israel. You can imagine 2 million people in the desert and trying to figure out who their God is, parked before this mountain and really sort of relearning who their Lord is and what he expects from them. Imagine all that they had seen in the plagues on Egypt, the leaving Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, of seeing this pillar of fire, pillar of cloud, leading them towards the promised land, and all the while trying to figure out what it is that is going on, and imagine all the supernatural things they had saw, and every person there would or should have been asking, what does this God expect of me? Who am I in his presence? Who is he? And what is expected of me? And so as they go before the mountain, we see that God's law, then this covenant law, is displayed. They are given the 10 Commandments, which are sort of the bones of the law. And then everything else sort of hangs on those that displays how to love God and how to love your neighbor and what that looks like. And so this case law becomes the sort of individual cases of what justice would look like, what mercy would look like, what fairness and really to stop the exploitive behavior, prevent of exploitive behavior that it comes so natural to humans. And really to protect those that don't have anyone to stand up for them, which is a big deal in God's eyes. And so we'll go on into chapter 23, and we'll see you'll see more of this as we go. Do not spread false reports. Chapter 23 of Exodus, verse 1. Do not spread false reports. Can you imagine this? If people stopped spreading false reports, Facebook would go out of business, Twitter would go out of business, half of our prominent media would go out of business. The news would be boring in their eyes because they couldn't sensationalize it and couldn't just sort of grab facts and use them as they saw fit. And as the media goes today, that the facts have so little to do with what they are putting forth as truth, and so do not spread false reports. What a different world we would live in if people stopped spreading false reports. Do not help a guilty person by being a malicious witness. So this is to say that someone is guilty, someone has told a lie, and so personal responsibility as dictated by God is that you don't back up a lie of another, your friend, your family, someone you owe a debt to. You just simply don't authenticate another person's lie and thereby making their guilt your guilt, and making their sin your sin. So don't let a liar use you in that way and bring you to their sin. And so honesty, integrity, you start seeing these sort of, you can't help but begin to start talking about these things and mentioning these things, that honesty, integrity, and character is so important in the life of a child of God. And so go on to verse 2. Do not follow the crowd in doing wrong. Well, everybody's doing it. I mean, if everybody's doing it, then it must be okay, right? I mean, if everybody is making a golden calf together and dancing naked around it and having a big party, then it must be okay, right? And that's sort of the mentality that they would use. And we don't have to look very far in our life before we fall into those same traps that, well, we sort of justify the sin because everybody else is doing it. We sort of weigh ourselves against the cultural norms and think, well, we're better than others, and that is not what the view we're supposed to take. That we are to be as if we are standing before God. And so we're not just going to follow the crowd as if somehow the crowd determines what is good, what is right, or even what is, if the crowd determines something is legal, doesn't mean that is acceptable to God, and which is another huge issue we see today. When you give testimony in a lawsuit, do not pervert to justice. Pervert means to twist, to bend, to just sort of massage justice and truth and facts and squish them around and make something you want out of them. And so that's the idea of perverting this, just to bend it, to distort it by, don't do this by siding with the crowd. Do not show favoritism to a poor person in a lawsuit. And so we see both sides of this. You see, one is you don't abuse and oppress those that can't defend themselves, the widow and the orphan, and those anger God, and he always comes to their defense. But at the same time, just because someone is poor, we don't show favoritism to them, which you see this in lawsuits all the time. You get the big corporation that has lots of money, therefore they should give it to the poor person. But let justice be justice, right be right, honesty be honesty. Let the value be the same across the board for all of God's creatures, and that the value placed on one life, on one situation, on the things of someone's life is, somehow their home is less because they're a poor person or they're, something else, but that we begin to place value on someone's power, someone's place within the culture, and instead of just on each one as a child of God. So verse 4, if you come across your enemy's ox or donkey wandering off, be sure to return it. And if you see the donkey or someone who hates you fallen down under its load, do not leave it there. Be sure you help them with it. So even if someone has, you're sideways with someone and you see this person's donkey falls under the load, that you see someone come under a difficult circumstance, that you're supposed to just look the other way and let come what may. If something happen that is going to damage their life, but to intervene in a kindness. And so there is again, integrity, character, of acting as God would have you act, not as our flesh would seek to even use a situation like that for revenge. So don't show favoritism when you would help this person with their donkey, but that guy over there not so much, because I like him and he can influence some circumstance in my life, but that person I just don't care for, they rub me wrong, whatever it may be. But that we're supposed to treat each one of them in an equal manner, in a loving way, as a kindness, as loving our neighbor and loving our neighbor as ourselves. So verse 6, do not deny justice to your poor people in their lawsuits, having nothing to do with a false charge have nothing to do with a false charge, and do not put an innocent or honest person to death, for I will not acquit the guilty. And so making very sure, very careful to not deny justice. Again, in our culture, we see justice as what has been totally changed. In justice is what who screams the loudest, who can make the most noise on social media, who can spin it up in a situation up, and justice is determined by a large crowd of people that can destroy a city, that can destroy a person's life. And instead of the justice system where someone is presumed innocent until proven guilty, and we've completely got away with that, even to the point of Congress declaring those that are supposed to uphold our laws are declaring people guilty before their day in the court, before they are even heard or had a chance to defend themselves, that we declare them guilty, that we've already determined that they should, be punished in some way. And so that's what has happened to justice in our day and age. And we have to guard against that, because it's used in a political fashion by one side who doesn't want that same measure, used against them. And so, justice in and of itself is that we all live under the same laws, under the same expectations, under the same punishments, and not that I get to determine the punishment for those that I don't like or don't agree with, but I don't want that measured back to me in the same way. And those that are in power tend to always, revert to that they have a different standard for their enemies because they're in power. And this is falls right into the social changes that we're seeing our day and age. And we have to watch for that. We have to guard against that. That's our liberties that are at stake. So make sure that we honor justice for what it is. Have nothing to do with a false charge. Don't pile on a false charge just because we can get away with it, that we can use a false charge to have our way in politics or anything else. I don't care what side you're on, and that's not even an issue of what side you're on. The issue is that justice and truth should be justice and truth, and not to use, people's lives are destroyed for political gain, and that's just wrong. And those things need to stop, and they'll only stop if people stand up and say that's not acceptable. Even if you agree politically, that you say that is not acceptable, it's not right to ruin someone's life or to do those things. And you can almost see it every day in the news now. Verse 8, do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds those who see and twists the words of the innocent. And again, boy, some of the things we see in our culture, we have to wonder what is going on behind the scenes. And so this is laid down from the beginning. Of these 70 elders that were going to step forward and help Moses judge the people, you can imagine 2 million people having a case. Somebody was always upset with someone. Someone always thought they were done wrong. But if you could just slide up alongside the judge and just make a little promise, and just slip a little here, a little there, and get the judge just to be a little bit more understanding of your side of the story, then justice would be perverted and twisted, and justice and truth and facts would be facts. And that is the whole point of this. Let facts be facts and justice be justice. Don't accept a bribe. And this was the integrity of those 70 judges that would act on this law, would give judgments to the people, and so their integrity is at stake when if they began to accept a bribe. The very fact that God has to give this as part of the law, that you can't accept a bribe, is pretty telling of our human nature and our sinful nature, that bribery would automatically sort of enter into the picture. And so there has to be sort of this line that says, we will not cross this line. You cannot cross this line. If you do, then will be deemed as bribery, and you would disqualify yourself. Verse 9, do not oppress a foreigner. You yourselves know how it feels to be foreigners, because you were foreigners in Egypt. Some of the worst oppressors are those that rise to power and oppress in a worse way than they were oppressed. And so it's just this reminder, remember where you came from. Don't forget where your past, as if somehow there was some goodness in you that rose to this place, and that you are now in a position that you should oppress others. But that remember that you were once a foreigner, and so to not put yourself in a situation where you're justifying oppressing foreigners in any way, shape, or form. It goes on into the Sabbath laws in verse 10. For 6 years you are to sow your fields and harvest your crops. But during the seventh year, let the land lie unplowed and unused. And then the poor among your people may get food from it. Any wild animals may eat what is left. Do the same with your vineyard and your olive grove. 6 days you are to work, but on the seventh day do not work, so that your ox and your donkey may rest, and so that the slave born in your household and the foreigner living among you may be refreshed. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Do not invoke the name of other gods, and do not let them be heard on your lips. And so you see sort of this transition as this moving away from this case law now, but it really part of their life was a very important part of their life was to be engaged in these things that would help them remember. So the Sabbath law was ordained by God. It was to help them remember who God was, and that the model of him creating the heaven and the earth in 6 days and resting on that seventh day. And he created that Sabbath not because God needed rest, but he was modeling it for man. And it was really a gift from him. The Sabbath was made for man. It was made for God. God doesn't need a Sabbath, but he shows it right here that even given the Sabbath for his creation as far as the fields and the harvest, to give them the land time to recover, and within doing that, there was also became a provision for the poor among the people. And what we don't really know here is if that Sabbath was always the seventh year was always the same for every field, for every person all the time, but that the Sabbath year for this land, this field maybe this year, but the Sabbath year for the other field maybe next year. So there could be this rotation within their fields, that they would have land lying fallow and recovering, and this the sort of the volunteer crop that would grow up out of that would become food for the poor, for the wild animals. And so it becomes part of God's provision. It lets the land recover, and but there's not any evidence that this was really ever done. We know from just in modern farming that something like this was a good thing. Of course, it's all done with chemicals now, that you chemically restore the land, but you have to wonder if that's truly doing the same thing as what a Sabbath year where the land would lay fallow, if that would truly plow that crop under, and then the volunteer crop comes up, and or even the olive grove, the vineyard, to let that fruit remain on the tree, to fall from the tree, and have others to glean from that. So it's kind of interesting to think about. It's a thought that in our economy, and really maybe even go so far as to say our greed, that we would never think of a Sabbath year in our crops. But it's fascinating because he puts forth this Sabbath field, using your fields and your vineyards, and creating sort of this Sabbath year prior to saying that there was a Sabbath day for your work. Well, everybody would have been in full agreement that we should not work that seventh day, that we need that seventh day off, but strangely enough, we don't necessarily look at the Sabbath year for our fields in the same way. 6 days you do your work. On the seventh day, you don't do any work. And not only this is for you, and so, man, I know many people would say, oh, just love the overtime, and they work 7 days a week repeatedly over and over again. But everybody knows that when you work those 7 days, when you work that 14 days straight, then that's 21 days straight, and it just goes on and on. They begin to the productivity declines, the sort of the mental capabilities of just begin to decline, and over time, because really just becomes sort of a burnout. And so we need our rest, and this is important to take our rest time. And even if you feel you don't need the rest, it makes the point that your animals need the rest, and by resting your animals, they recover and be ready to produce when the next 6 day cycle begins. And the same way with those that are your workers, the foreigner living among you that is working, someone in your household that is serving, that they also need to rest. And it would be your responsibility, if you are leading those in the head of that household, to provide that time of rest for them. And so interesting that makes the point to say, be careful. Be careful with this, because it's important. Be careful to do everything I have said to you. Don't invoke the names of other gods. This is not to be confused and mixed with the worship of other gods. Don't even let these other gods be heard on your lips. So there is great care in following these Sabbath laws, great care to be used in making sure you're not bringing other gods into the picture. 3 times a year, you're to celebrate a festival to me. Celebrate the festival of unleavened bread, which joins right with Passover. And for 7 days you eat bread made without yeast, as I commanded you to do this at the appointed time in the month of Aviv. For in that month you came out of Egypt. So this is what is later taught the month of Nisan. The rite joined up with Passover, and so the Feast of Unleavened Bread was to accompany that. And these are the feast, one of the primary feasts that they were to take part of. It was commemorating that coming out of Egypt, that their bread was made without yeast, and it's to show that they came out in a rush, and so there was no time for their bread to rise. And so that is, like I said, right in with the Passover, which you see at the Passover meal, the very same thing, that it's to be standing up with your staff in your hand, and as if you were ready to go. We were in a hurry. We have to leave. And they had to leave as soon as the Passover lamb was slaughtered. And they ate of this meal as soon as that they were passed over by the death angel that protected behind the blood of that lamb, that then they came out of Egypt. And certainly a picture of Christ in many ways. Makes the point, no one is to appear before me empty-handed. An interesting insertion there, that no one was to come to these feasts without an offering, that to come to the tabernacle, later to the temple, to come empty-handed without a sacrifice, that was something that they needed to consider. Then the next verse 16, celebrate the festival of harvest with the first fruits of the crops you sow in the field. So this was the Feast of Weeks, is Pentecost. It was 50 days after the Sabbath during Passover, 50 days after the day after the Sabbath during Passover. And so what was called Pentecost, and of course we know that Pentecost became that picture of the birth of the church. So this was the Feast of First Fruits, this or Feast of Weeks, and it was with the first fruits of your crops that you sow. The first fruits being sort of bringing that offering of your grain, and it was a representative of all the grain that was to be that was harvested. And it was giving that offering to God as if to say, God, this just represents the rest of what I harvested, but God, it's all yours. That the entire harvest is yours. It is all at your hands. That you own it all, and that you are offering that back to Him in acknowledgement of that. And of course, the idea of first fruits we often associated with Christ being the first fruits of the grave, that as He rose again from the grave, the first fruit of the grave, that He was representative of this future harvest that would come, and that in later days that there would be many to follow Christ as He overcame death in the grave, that He provided a way for many to follow and overcome death in the grave in the same way of the greater harvest to come. Then the third one's to celebrate the festival of ingathering, which is also called the Feast of Tabernacles, at the end of the year, and when you gather your crops in the fields. And the Feast of Tabernacles was, sort of building these little shelters, and again commemorating the time that they were in the wilderness, the time coming out of Egypt. And so celebrating that, it was a time of thankfulness. It's an ingathering again of their crops from their fields, and another time of just worshiping the Lord and acknowledging all of that He has done. Verse 17 then, 3 times a year all men are to appear before the sovereign Lord. And so while there were other festivals and other things, that there was these 3 things set throughout the year become very very important to who they were in their relationship to God. Again, we talked earlier about if you were one of those 2 million people seeing all that this happened, would you not ask God, what is it that you expect of me? And we might find ourselves in the same way, and we ought to. You think of all that the Lord has done for you, as the Lord has saved you by the work that was done on the cross through repentance and faith, turning from your sin and trusting in the work that Christ did to pay for your sin debt on the cross. And that should bring us a point would say, Lord, I receive that grace that you offer, and that I repent and I trust in the work that you did. And then the next thing is like, if that is true, and if He really did that for you, and if you are now saved from your sin, then what ought your reaction to be? How should this reflect in my life? And what does God expect of me? And so we can put ourselves in that very same frame of mind that these people were. And this was part of what He expected. It was this honesty and this integrity. And it wasn't to be a set of rules of do and do and do and don't, but to reflect our God, to have a heart of loving our God and loving our neighbor, and a heart of grace and kindness and mercy as God has shown them. And so part of establishing that sort of that walk of day in and day out of living that life that the Lord would have them live was to have these annual feasts and this remembrance. Well, we sort of do the same thing with celebrating the birth of Christ at Christmas, celebrating the resurrection of Christ in the spring, and what we refer to as Easter, celebrating the resurrection the death, burial, and resurrection of the Lord. We celebrate on a regular basis at our churches with the Lord's Supper and taking of the Lord's Supper, and we do that in remembrance of Him. And so we sort of had these things set in our life that become these remembrance, and that's what the Lord was setting up in their life, that 3 times a year all these men would come forth. And notice that is the men are to have this remembrance, that you see this responsibility of the men to be the spiritual leaders, to be that foundational strength, and spiritual leaders to lead. And frankly, we just don't see that today. We see such a weakness, in general. You sort of say it in a joking way, but so serious. But men are spiritual couch potatoes, and we often just find ourselves sitting back and letting the ladies do it, and they do such a great job. And they're jumping in and filling gaps, and people want to make an issue about that at times, but frankly, it's more of a reflection on the men than it is the ladies and the churches even. But that men are not stepping up, and I believe that a lot of that has to do with what our culture has done to men, and in general. But that's a topic for another day. Verse 18, do not offer the blood of a sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. Yeast becomes this picture of sin. It was like this leaven becomes this leaven. It's used to picture in the New Testament of the leaven that works its way through the whole lump, that sin just spreads through lives and through cultures and through families and on. And so don't offer this blood sacrifice to me along with anything containing yeast. It was probably something that was done in pagan cultures and pagan worship, and worship some of these idols and false gods. And so the Lord restricts that, says don't bring that to me. And so this idea of this yeast becomes almost this picture of sin. It was something that was left in Egypt. In that old life, when they came out with this bread without yeast, and which sort of brings you to this idea that Jesus saying that He was the bread of life too. So there's lots of little ties there that are pretty fascinating to consider. The fat of my festival offerings must not be kept until morning. Bring the best of the first fruits of your soil in the house to the house of the Lord your God, and do not cook a young goat in mother's milk. And again, it's sort of this cooking a young goat in its mother's milk was sort of a pagan magic potion that was sort of cooked up and for I don't even remember what it was for in their world. That was something that was done in these pagan worship, and that if you did this, that somehow God was going to do something, their God, and not Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so again, it was God setting this separation and saying, this is that old life, the things that were left in Egypt, the things that are left into these other cultures. But when you serve me, you don't do that. And so this is sort of the basis of in a kosher diet, in the Jewish kosher diet, is a separation of meat and dairy, where they've sort of taken that verse and carried that into their idea of keeping God's law, that they would separate, so being so careful that they separate all the dairy and the meat in that way. And so many of these things that we may not understand probably can all be sort of linked back to God creating that separation for from those pagan cultures, from those other gods, from their idols, from their old life. Verse 20, see, I am sending an angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to a place I have prepared. This is a kind of a passage that creates a lot of discussion. Who is this angel? And we see these sort of similar discussions in when you get into the New Testament. Angel is sort of a messenger. It's used at times to describe both a human messenger but also a divine messenger. And so this Hebrew word malach is this a heavenly being, an angel, a servant of God, or is this a person? Is this Moses, or is this the angel of the Lord that is going to lead them? And so let's go on and look at that. But that's a point of discussion. Is this, he says, I'm sending this angel ahead of you to guard you along the way and to bring you to the place I have prepared. Pay attention to him and listen to what he says. So from that, he said, well, this angel is going to speak to them. He's going to give them direction. Do not rebel against him. He will not forgive your rebellion. So this angel has the ability to forgive their rebellion when they rebel. And then he says, since my name is in him. That's probably the most telling part right there. That is very fascinating. That my name is in him. How is the name of Yahweh in this messenger? And so you see many speculations, even right down to sort of the letters that are used to spell the name of God are included in the letters, and or El is sort of they use other names for these leaders, and that included the idea of El Shaddai, or one of the names of God. So, but I don't think we're supposed to. I don't think this verse is telling us to sort of pick apart the letters like it's some secret code to figure out who this messenger is, but simply that God was providing this angel that would lead them forth. There would be direction. And you have to at least consider that this might be an Old Testament appearance of Christ, that this angel of the Lord, we see this angel of the Lord designation, and it looks like Christ in many ways. But we also see many times that the angels that speak for the Lord, that Lord puts these heavenly messengers and these heavenly servants out there to do and act and speak for him as he would designate. So there's no reason that we would have to say that this has to be Christ, that it could very well be an angel. And there's at least some thought that this is Moses. That what does it mean? My name is in him. Can that not mean the Spirit of God is in Moses? That Moses walks and acts and speaks for God as a priest to God, and a priest for God to the people, and that God's Spirit is on him. And so there's a couple considerations. I don't know that we can say, this is right and this is wrong, but there's some fascinating thought around that. If you listen carefully, again, the idea that great care when we're listening to the Lord, great care to take care of what he has said to do. And so listen carefully to what he says and do all that I say. I will be an enemy to your enemies and will oppose those who oppose you. And again, we sort of give you pause that the God that they saw deliver them from Egypt, that brought all these plagues forth, to the superpower of the world, brought Pharaoh to his knees, divided a sea and brought 2 million people through this, delivered them to this place. Now he says, I will be an enemy to your enemies and oppose those who oppose you. That's a pretty big deal. My angel, verse 23, my angel will go ahead of you, and he'll bring you into the land of the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, Canaanites, Hivites, and Jebusites, and I will wipe them out. He says, I will wipe them out. Do not bow down before their gods or worship them or follow their practices. So he established that he is going to be on their side, that anyone who opposes them are opposing him, and that they are to identify with him and him alone, that he is going to do this work in bringing them there. He's going to wipe out their enemies, and that they are not to bow down before these other gods or worship them. And he says this almost, knowing, not almost, but knowing that this is going to be a problem for them. It is a problem for all of us. It is a problem for us today. Our gods look different. Our idols are a little bit different than they were in those days, but man has not changed. And we turn our face from God towards our idols constantly. And you go back to listen carefully, and how does this apply to our life, and how do we make sure that we are walking with him? He says, you must not demolish them, talking about their gods, their altars, pagan altars. You must demolish them, break their sacred stones to pieces. Worship the Lord your God, and his blessing will be on your food and water. I will take away sickness from among you, and none will miscarry or be barren in your land. I will give you a full lifespan. So you see this idea of a long life and a quality life is what God spoke of before. Not just living, not just existing, but a long life and a quality life in his presence, him taking care of them, of dealing with their enemies, of bringing them to the land, of providing them food and water and shelter and protection, and dealing with their sickness, but even reproducing. That he said you won't miscarry or be barren in the land. This was always a temptation for him, because so much of these pagan gods, goddesses were about fertility, and having lots of kids, having a large family was such a blessing for them, and that was what they looked at as something that was so important. If you had lots of kids, God loved you and was blessing you in a great way. If you had no kids, you were looked down on. The God must be angry with you in some way. And so he's saying you won't miscarry, you won't be barren, but that he would bless you and again give you that long and full life. And boy, you had a lot of kids, you would have a full life in that culture for sure. Verse 27, I will send my terror ahead of you and throw into confusion every nation you encounter. We see little glimpses of this. We don't see specifics, but we see crazy victories. You can go right into current times, and you see the terror that just seems supernatural, that comes from strange ways it shows up, but that God defeats the enemies of Israel, throws them into confusion, and crazy things happen, and God wins their battles. He say, I will make your enemies turn their backs and run. I will send the hornet ahead of you to drive out the Hivites, Canaanites, Hittites out of your way. You even send the hornets to drive them out. That's fascinating. But I will not drive them out in a single year, because the land would become desolate and wild animals too numerous for you. So God's got this. God controls the timing. We never like God's timing. We are always opposed to God. It's never fast enough for us. We always think we can handle more. God knows, and to us his timing is frustrating to us. But God knows how long it should take, and that this will be a process that they would work through in taking over this land. To just drive them all out immediately would create a vacuum in which the wild animals would overrun the land and become as large a problem as all of these other cultures that were in the land. Verse 30, little by little I will drive them out before you until you have increased enough to take possession of the land. Verse 31, I will establish your borders from Red Sea to the Mediterranean, from the desert of the Euphrates River. I will give into your hands the people who live in the land, and you will drive them out before you. So I will give into your hands the people who live in the land, and you will drive them out before you. So it's interesting because the Lord said just a few verses up, he said, I will conquer the land. I will give you this. And then he says, you will do it. And so we see that there was the Lord says, I'm going to do this, but you see that the expectation, responsibility was for them, that by faith that God was going to do this. By faith, they had to act on what God's promise, and that when God says, okay, now go and do this, that they would step forth by faith and say, God has already said this is going to happen, and they take action as directed by God. So he said, I'll give them into your hands, the people who live in the land, and would drive them out before you. Do not make a covenant with them or with their gods, which we see this become a problem in several places. Do not make a covenant with them or with their gods. Do not let them live in your land, or they will cause you to sin against me, because the worship of their gods will certainly be a snare to you. So the snare would be just like a trap laid, that if you let them and you compromise, it's like, oh, everybody deserves, and we just let them have, and we can all get along and it'll all be okay. It's just like a little trap, a little infection that you leave over there, and you leave unattended until that little leaven just sort of leavens through the whole culture. And how isn't it amazing that holiness, righteousness in a dark place doesn't just automatically spread through the whole culture like leaven, but that a little bit of wickedness, a little bit of evil will spread through all of the culture and infect the entire culture. You just look around today, you can see the very same thing. And so the Lord, you will see this further and further. The Lord says, you must purge the evil from among you. You must set it outside from among you, that there is a expectation that when you walk with God, that you are going to be his children. He is going to be your God, that he says, this is what I expect from you, that we are in a constant pursuit of loving him and loving our neighbors. And what does that look like? Every day we have to be working and striving towards living that life, and not striving in a way of working and trying to as if like we have to earn our salvation, or we have to maintain our salvation by our works, but that we pursue him out of love. We pursue him and this precious gift that he's given us, that our right response is to act in these ways. We do it with great joy. We do it with in a Sabbath rest of Christ, that all the work has been done. And so we are simply striving to walk with him and to love him and to respond to the kindness and the graciousness that he has given into our lives. And in doing so, that means that we have to set aside those sinful things, that we have to keep those things away and separate ourselves from those things, and not make provision for our flesh in our life, not make provision. So, when we surrender to Christ, it is to be an unconditional surrender, that there is no provision for the flesh. And the flesh will always sort of ease back into the picture. It's always sort of come back on us and find a place and find a home in our lives if we don't surrender that to the Lord constantly. This is what it means to take up your cross daily and to follow him, and to die daily, and that this old man wants to also be resurrected, and we can't let that happen. So that's the great adventure of Exodus chapter 23, and the adventure will continue soon. Please hit the like and subscribe if you enjoy these videos. I'd love to hear your comments also, and we'll see you when we take on chapter 24. Thank you.